Thank you. So I've been working on this for a really long time. I started this with my master's degree, and we really start with how I came to this topic, because it's pretty gruesome and it's pretty horrible. But it's a story of domination, a story of resistance and survival, and it's a story of sadistic forced sexual domination as well. It's ugly, it's uncomfortable, and it's brutal. But I graduated from college as a history major, and I was just determined I knew everything and then some about history. I had my bachelor's, and I went to Europe for the first time. And I realized at that moment that I knew nothing. I had barely scraped the surface, and I had heard all about these American witch trials, which you guys are probably familiar with because they kind of talk about them a lot. K-12, you hear about these American witch trials. But they don't tell you about what happened in Western Europe before that, because really, that was just the end, very, very end of it, are those American witch trials. What they don't tell you about is the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women who were executed, who were tortured, who died from their wounds. They don't tell you about any of that. So, not until you get to grad school. I learned about it then. But that was my first trip, and my interest was piqued. And I came back and I started researching and I started looking at things, and I went back a second time to do archival research, as we do, as we're learning to be historians at the master's level. And I went and I started looking at the trial records in the British Library, going back to those primary sources that are so very important to historians. And I went back to those primary records, and I'm sitting in the British Library, and I noticed that on these papers, there's black. And I thought, well, maybe they have some sort of paper fungus. Maybe they have some sort of disease. And I asked, because I had been there for a couple of weeks, and I had gotten to be friends with the people that worked in this area. And I asked them, and they looked at me, and they got this really weird look on their face. And they turned around, and they put their hand on my shoulder, this one woman, and she goes, "Honey, that's blood spatter." That was the moment I became a historian. That's the moment when I decided that their voices need to be heard. That their voices need to be heard, because I had read all of these works, and none of them had, they'd given you maybe little snippets, but they never told you who these women are. So every time I give this lecture, it's absolutely for the women who died at the hands of evil. I have listened, I have heard, I have cried, I am humbled by telling their story. And I'm honored every time to tell their story. So you need a little bit of background evidence, or a little bit of background about it. Today I'm really talking to you about the witch trials in early modern Europe. I'm detailing the experience of real women who endured the attentions of their sadistic torturers. They use God, they're going to use science and medicine to destroy the women who spoke up and restrain the women who don't. So many ask why women go along with this, and well, not all did, but they will become targets as well. So if you don't go along with this, you become a target. So the first question we have to answer is why. Both science and religion initiated social changes in the early modern period that create an atmosphere of intolerance and put women in a position of vulnerability, thus allowing women to become victims of deviant men and liable to be labeled witches. Now, as we're answering this question, why, we need to know that, both science and religion initiate these social changes. The Protestant Reformation and the Scientific Revolution, you can tell, are overlapping. You also have the Spanish Inquisition going on during this time period. So we're not going to leave out the Catholics. Can't do that. So society is in a period of flux because religion is changing. Politics is in a flux as people are deciding, you know, how those boundaries are going to be changing. Religion is clearly changing because this is one of the big breaks within the Christian time period with the Protestant Reformation. So it even comes down to the political geography, because sometimes these rulers are deciding whether or not they want to be Christian or whether or not they want to be Catholic, and it may change from ruler to ruler in the line of succession. So people are there's this constant change and constant fluctuations happening there. And all of this is happening, and it means some very specific things. First, we need to look at the religious perspective. The Reformation, whether we're talking about the Protestant Reformation or the Catholic Counter-Reformation, it shapes people's worldview. Those of you who've been in a history class know that religion shapes the worldview of the person. And modifications and new methods of worshiping God is going to change the view of the community and increase the value placed on living a godly life. So basically what's happening is both Protestants and Catholics are moving towards orthodoxy, the strict observance of their religion. Now, these changes in belief, or these shifts in what's acceptable and what's unacceptable in these new religions, cause some very unexpected tensions. People place a large emphasis on the continuation of the patriarchal structure. They're also starting to pay attention a lot more to women and what women are doing and how women are doing it, and really if they are truly in doing what they need to do. Now, women who don't conform to these new gender roles that are established for them will be held in contempt. They'll be reviled. They'll become something other than a good woman. And when you move out of what is acceptable, you become the other. So women have a duality of freedom and restrictions. So they're free to defile themselves. They're free to become witches, but yet they are also bound by these very strict gender roles that they can't break free of. Now, understand that while the gender roles are oftentimes created by men, they are also enforced by women. So this isn't just, bashing the guys. The women are participating in this as well, and what it means to be a good woman and who is not a good woman. So as women are held to these rigorous standards of behavior, any deviation would immediately cast them in the role of a bad woman or other. Now, within the Protestant Reformation, you have this change where women are really responsible for the choices that they're making and the actions that they take. We see this in an increased education for women. Protestant women are going to be taught to read so that they can read the Bible, and that they can read the Bible to their children, and that they can teach their children to read. Those are some of the traditional evidence that we would give to say, yes, women are starting to become responsible for their own salvation. Women are starting to become responsible for their own things that way. But we really have to understand that early modern mindset. And see, that's where you really get persnickety, if you will. You have to understand, these guys we're talking about, they're real people, but they actually believe that Satan is someone you can touch, somebody you can wrestle with. Calvin and Luther both talk about physically wrestling with them. These actual physical things. So when you think of this evil as being something you can actually touch, it's also something that can persuade and eventually get to the point where it will defile. Now, Satan is out there traveling around looking to corrupt. And there's this concept that's going to come out with this, or push towards orthodoxy, and these ideas. You're going to see a lot of changes about marriage and all kinds of different changes within their societies. But anything that's sexual, including the body, is really going to start becoming bad. Covering it up, keeping it covered, keeping it quiet, keeping it really in its own place. And it also needs to be controlled. Now, this is going to include sex and sexuality, and we'll see this with the writings that are coming out of the period. We see this with the laws that are put into place, and probably the most visible being the changes in dress. So if you think about the medieval dress versus a early modern woman's dress, you see by early modern you've got the big ruffs you may have seen. They're covering up, and whereas you go to the medieval, you've got the bosom basically falling out. All of a sudden, we're going to cover up, button down, and control the body, sex, and sexuality. So we're suppressing sexuality, and both gender historians and his sexuality historians, and even historians who are dealing with psychohistory, have pretty much agreed that when there is extreme repression of sexuality, you find slippage points. And the witch trials actually become one of these slippage points. So you have this new emphasis on personal piety. You are responsible for whatever sins you commit. Anytime you deviate from your gender role, you have committed a sin, is really kind of where they're looking at this. So what happens is these changing gender roles are so rigid that women already understand themselves as guilty of something. Because maybe they were bitchy to their neighbor. Maybe they got in a fight with their husband. Maybe they did something that was outside the appropriate gender role. And in doing so, they already have internalized their guilt. So when it comes, if an accusation comes, they are already seeing themselves as guilty. Maybe not of the crimes they're accused of, but guilty of something. So as we move through the early modern period, women are going to be deemed by men of religion as mentally inferior, easily swayed, lascivious, lustful creatures who will be out to corrupt. Now, women will accept and internalize these beliefs, and they understand, that's how they understand themselves, that they have to control or suppress any desire. Now, you also need to understand, when talking about the religion in the time period, that there is a very strong belief in harmful magic. And between the tangibility of Satan and the ability to cast harmful spells, women are more susceptible and targets of evil because that's how they will find power. So we also have some changes in science. And this image is actually another period image. It's actually coming from scientific texts. And what they're talking about is the wandering uterus. This would be the woman's uterus. It really kind of, you can really get into a really good conversation about how the women's body itself, it's always the uterus's fault. It's always going to be the uterus's fault, and it doesn't matter whether she's got pain in her shoulder, it's her uterus. If she's got sore joints, it's the uterus. Okay? But women are in a process of both gaining and losing authority, but the changes in religion show them to lose authority. The changes in science, now they're going to have science compounding on this. So there's religion and then science. And science is going to tell them that, well, women are essentially weaker. Women are physically weaker, mentally weaker, emotionally weaker, and religiously weaker. Even Rousseau compares women to a house cat. I love Rousseau. All right, so as we look in science, science is starting to answer a lot of the questions because of the flux in religion. So now as we look to science, science is coming up and saying, hey, we're going to start answering some of these things, and we're going to look and see that every time you drop it, it's going to fall down. We're going to start answering all of those questions and say, well, God put in these natural laws. God put in these things, and it's up to us to figure them out and decode them. And what they come up with is that the female form is the weaker form and essentially a birth defect. That men have the appropriate genitals on the outside, and women have an inverted or defective set of genitals, which makes them, once again, less than male. That's what science is telling us. The male form is the controlled form. The women's body is not a controlled body. The scientific revolution is all about control. It's all about control and dominating and understanding their own environment and understanding it to control it. And in order to do this, they're going to perform experiments and all kinds of things. But women's bodies, they can't control, which becomes problematic because we have the body that leaks. We have the body that lactates. We have the body that menstruates. We have the body that gives birth. It's an uncontrolled body. And so women's nature itself will become this uncontrolled idea. Now, all of us leaves women in a very precarious state. They are now the other. And if they're the other, they are not like us. When we create an other, we can do lots of things to them that we wouldn't normally do to someone who is like us. So, when one group is more marginalized and thought to be less, it becomes easier to understand. Women understand themselves according to these doctrines, these new ideas, these new beliefs. They know that they can't possibly uphold the orthodoxy or the levels that they need to so that they understand they are in fact guilty of something, if not witchcraft. And looking specifically at this picture, you can see all the ways in which women are deviating from the traditional women's behaviors. This would be a traditional devil's Sabbath. So you see both the animal images here, you see the animal images here of women going off to essentially copulate with Satan in certain fashions. You also have a woman here. We're really re-emphasizing the baptismal idea here, but instead of baptizing a baby to bring it into the fold and life, you're dunking the baby into boiling water or oil to kill the child, which is exactly against the maternal instinct. So what they're going to do, and again, this is a period piece coming out. They're clearly fornicating with men who are inhuman, and this idea of reverse baptism all go to creating women as the other. And if this is what you are convicted of, then it's okay to do whatever, because she's killed babies. She's had sex with Satan in animal forms. These are the things that she will be accused of. But you need to understand the witch trials themselves are very circular in nature. They start with an accusation, and they move all the way through, and they're going to end with an accusation and execution. Because more accusations and executions will go in. We need to talk specifically about the trials, but again, let me reiterate, I'll be prioritizing women's voices as we integrate them into this structure. So, the accusation. This is actually a American witch trial here, but it definitely gives you that passion. This is more of a period piece. The accusation can come in several ways, either from within or from without. And what I mean by within is it can come from within your community. Your minister may put a box in the sanctuary, and you can write down somebody's name and put it in, and that's an accusation. You could just whisper to the minister that you think so-and-so is a witch. You can, if you have someone you've gone to court with, and maybe you didn't like the result, you can throw out that accusation of witch. So it can come from the inside, which usually will come throughout the church structure, or it can come from the outside, which is witch finders will come to town, and they will gather all the people, and they will talk about what it is to be a witch, and if you know anyone who is a witch, then you should let them know, because religions state, the Bible will tell them you should not suffer a witch to live, and if you shouldn't suffer a witch to live, we need to find them and purge them from the community, or you're all guilty. So these witch finders will come in, and they will try to convict as many women as possible. But here's the thing. They're not paid, because it's a job, they're not paid by how many women they examine. They're paid by how many women they find guilty. So it behooves them to find a lot of women guilty. Now, probably the final way an accusation would come is an accusation would come while someone is being tortured. Because they will ask, after they've been convicted, who are your accomplices? And if you don't give up any accomplices, then what's going to happen is they're going to put you back and torture you again. But at this point, they have nothing to lose. These people are already guilty. They're the other. You can do whatever you want to them. And the torture then will be even more horrific and more barbaric and much more sexualized. So, again, we're looking at that circular nature. We've talked about the accusation. Let's talk about gathering evidence. Now, what can make you a witch? Well, if they go in and search your house and they find clay or wax figures, if you have the personality of a witch, that can make you a witch. If you are talking to a witch, that could make you possibly a witch. If you take a close interest in someone who is already accused, that could lead to suspicion. The reports of your neighbors, so if your neighbors don't like you, they can say you're a witch, and that could definitely cause some doubt as to your authenticity. Your servants, your family can all accuse you. In addition, testimony of other witches and someone on their deathbed says that so-and-so is a witch and then dies and you're left hanging. Bleeding of a corpse of a person who they've suspected is killed by witchcraft. If you walk into the room and the corpse starts bleeding, then you obviously are the one that killed them. That's the sign. Examination of children or servants of the witch. Again, they will examine them intently. Spectral evidence or preternatural knowledge. Preternatural knowledge is it's kind of intriguing. So if you were a person walking down the road and you've got some bushes next to you and you hear on the other side of the bushes somebody talking crap about you, and you stop and you listen, and you hear them talking all this just gossip about you, and you go and confront them, and they look at the other person and say, I didn't see you there. I didn't see, and they talk to the friend that they were talking to and say, she has preternatural knowledge. She knows something she shouldn't know. And there's no way she could have seen it because we would have heard her on the other side of the hedge. So she must be a witch. So what is the general personality of a witch that could cause this? Well, if you're female, because about 90% of those executed are going to be women, different areas will have higher, other areas lower. Middle-aged, anywhere from 25, yes, 25 is middle-aged, to 60. If you're of the wrong religion, so if you're in a Protestant area and you're Catholic, that could make you a witch. If you're married but have few to no children, that could make you a witch. If you're frequently involved in trouble or conflict or you fight with your family members, that could make you a witch. If you've been accused of crimes previously, like slander, theft, or assault of speech, which means you told somebody off and they reported you, you're more likely than not to have a medical profession on a local or an informal basis. You have a relatively low social position, and you could be considered abrasive in style, contentious in character, and stubbornly resilient. So if they just can't beat you down, that could be an indication that you too are a witch. Looking specifically, what they're going to do is the witch's mark and the witch's teat. They're going to be looking for this. It's part of the ordeal process of what they're looking for, and you can see that here they're going through the process of pricking a witch. They're looking for that witch's mark or witch's teat. And what that is it could be anything. It could be a flea bite, it could be a freckle, it could be a mole, a skin tag. Any of those little things, those anomalies, a birth defect could be your witch's mark. And if that doesn't work, there's always the clitoris. They will consider that to be a witch's teat or a devil's mark. And what it is, truly is where Satan has marked you as his own when you have had sexual relations with him for the first time. And that's how you get this mark. Now, all of this is designed to gather the evidence of witchcraft. Some of them will actually confess voluntarily before undergoing these ordeals. This is the ordeals that they're going to go through. Probably the most common is pricking the witch. And what your witch finder will do is take a bodkin or a pin, and he's going to take this bodkin or pin and he's going to start inserting it into the women over and over again, because the devil's mark or the witch's teat is said to be someplace that won't have blood, and it's said to be something that won't bleed when pricked. Now, we don't have nice little sewing pins like we're talking about now. We're talking about something much thicker. But how many of us have gotten a paper clip that cut and it hurt really bad, but it didn't bleed? It could happen. Also, how many of you have ever been in the situation where somebody like punches you in the arm and your leg hurts? It's this theory of confused sensation. As we learn more and more about the nervous system and the body, we've found that this actually can happen. So as these women are being questioned, and as they're being asked about this in a very sexualized manner, they're going to be questioned, and he's going to say, I have a direct quote, I think. When they're looking for this mark, he'll say to her, and presently in sight of all the people, he lays her body naked to the waist, and her clothes over her head, and he runs a hand over her body, and ran a pin into her thigh, then let her coats fall, and then demanded if she had anything of his inside of her. Those are coming from the trial records themselves. These are coming from the inquisitional records that are coming out of this. And you can see here, they're stripping her down, and he's got the pin, and he's going to start, and they start at the top of her body, and they work all the way down. She will be completely shaved. She will be put on a pedestal, and she will be pricked. She will, if they can't find anything, if she's constantly bleeding everywhere they do this, they will be routinely searching her breasts, her vagina, and her anus. They will routinely search the genitals, searching for these marks. And they do it in a very, very sexualized way. There are other ordeal processes. Some of these ordeal processes is the order of trial by fire. That doesn't mean they're going to burn the witch. What the trial by fire are often where you put hot irons and you have to carry those hot irons for a certain amount of time, or walk over them and be on them for a certain amount of time. And if you heal quickly, God showed you favor, therefore you must not be guilty. If you heal normally slow or just normal, then you're guilty because God didn't show you any favor. Swimming the witch, we're all pretty familiar with the idea of dunking this witch, and they actually will do that. The idea here behind this is that pure water would not sink, or something pure will not accept an evil witch. So if the woman floats, which is pretty much the only way she'd be able to stay alive, is if the woman floats, she is guilty, and she's automatically guilty. If she sinks, they're going to try to pull her out, but again, she's got now sodden clothes, lots of layers, and they can't get her out, and she can't swim. They found in Edinburgh, they found the remains when they did the Princess Street Park from all the gunk that came out from the medieval castle and the early modern castle. It all kind of pooled in what's now a park on Princess Street, and when they started sucking up all this gunk because they wanted to put the park in, they found the remains of quite a few women. And they found these remains of these women who had actually passed the test. And even if they are able to pull you out, what are the chances in this sewage-laden lake that you will still be healthy after you've done this. So again, it's that circular nature of the witch trials. We're gathering evidence, we're moving through the ordeal process. Once they are set aside as guilty, they still need a confession. They need the confession to justify what they are doing to these women. So you have to understand that there is an extremely sexual nature to a lot of these confessions. Once the confession is taken down, you then have to repeat it in open court. If you recant, you go back to the torture chamber. Some of the confessions will come voluntarily because, again, maybe you can avoid some of this stuff and just go straight to death. At least that might be your hope. Some of them will be said to confess voluntarily, meaning they only use the first or possibly second degree of torture, and then voluntarily repeat it in the open courtroom. Now, there is this very sexual, overt thing. Here, obviously, you have Satan impaling her. Again, this same thing you've seen. Again, here you've got a woman kissing Satan's butt. There's a very overt, very sexualized element to these images. There's also a very sexualized element to what they're doing. They talk about sex with Satan in different forms, in the form of an animal. They talk about the feel of Satan's penis, the actual feelings that they get upon penetration, and it's very, very ritualistic depending on which particular area you're looking at. But they're going to confess under torture as well. Margaret Barclay and her sister Janet will argue throughout the courts. They're constantly accusing each other of slander until they take Margaret Barclay and her sister-in-law accuses her of witchcraft. Her response when she sends her husband to go get an attorney so she can be defended in court and understand the process. And when her husband finally gets there, she says in open court, "But all I have confessed was an agony of torture, and before God, all I have spoken is untrue." And then to her husband, she says, "You have been too long in coming." The jury refuses her retraction. Once she is confessed, she is confessed. Now, you have several different types of tortures that are going to go through. And maybe we've all jokingly said something about the third degree. Well, there actually are degrees of torture. The first degree of torture is when you show them what you're going to do to them, or you tell them what you're going to do to them. Oftentimes, if a woman confesses at that point, that's voluntary, because we didn't do anything to her. The second degree of torture is anything that really won't kill you. So some of the things that they will do to these women in their first experiences are the pillowinks. There's crushing. The pillowinks will crush the hands and the fingers, and it's just like putting a vice on and just completely crushing the fingers until the marrow runs. They'll also do this with their legs. Throwing is very common, where and it's really low tech. You just take a rope, you throw it over a beam, you tie the woman's hands to it, and you hang her up, and you hang weights from her feet until every joint in her body dislocates, and then you can just drop her up and down. And if those things don't seem to work, you have women like Alison Balfour of Orkney. She doesn't confess after 48 hours of torture. When they started on her children, she confesses and is set aside as guilty. But this is after they've destroyed her daughter's hands and were starting on her son's legs. They were 6 and 8 years old, about. But you also have some very sexualized tortures that are going to be used. If you look, you can see some of these things. If you go to the torture exhibit down in Balboa Park, you can actually see a lot of these that are there. You have sitting the witch, which is where you take this and you sit the woman on top of it, and essentially her own body weight will allow that to penetrate her. There are the breast pinchers or breast rippers, where they will actually remove the breasts while the women are conscious, and they remove the breasts. There are other sexualized tortures that we'll see even more so when they start asking for accomplices. They become even more sexualized. Now, they must repeat their confession in open court. Again, this is a U.S. picture, but it kind of gives you the idea of what these courtrooms would be like. The purpose of this is they have to justify and purify the society, and they want to justify the actions taken. As they're doing these horrible things to women, they have to say, but it's okay to do this to her because she is other, because she is guilty, because she has done this. It's acceptable to treat her in this fashion. After she's been set aside as guilty in a courtroom, they can pretty much do whatever they want to her. The final torture session, first they're going to ask her, who are your accomplices in open court? And if she doesn't respond with lots of names, or if she doesn't give them the names they're looking for, then she'll go back to the torture chamber. That's the purpose of this final examination, is to find out who her cohorts are. And so one of the most common things women will do in early modern courts is called pleading the belly, which means they're pregnant. And they say, you can't kill me now. You have to wait until I'm firm to deliver the child. But that doesn't work in the witch trials. Because as you can see here, this is French. It's a French woodcut. You can see what they'll do here is they'll just hang you upside down, saw you in half, because it's assumed that the child is Satan's. You will live until it hits your breastbone. You will watch your child die. And this is what they will do. This is called the vaginal pear. It's the same thing. One's closed, one's open. The vaginal pear is actually, they'll use the pear on women who have essentially had sex with Satan, which is pretty much all of them. They will use this, and what it does is they'll insert it into the woman, and they'll actually use this on men who are tried for being gay, women who have confessed to oral copulation. They'll use it on their mouths as well. But they'll insert it into whichever orifice you have sinned with, and then they will open it up, and you can see the spikes here. And how, as they open it up and then remove it, the woman's reproductive system will be completely shredded. Women will die during these tortures, but they're not generally counted in the numbers of the executions. Because if women die under torture, they're not actually executed. So a lot of traditional historians don't count them in the numbers. They don't count the numbers the women who have died trying to escape. They haven't counted the numbers of women who are essentially just told to get out of the town and they're shoved off into the forest and are never heard from again. We assume they are eaten by wild animals. That's why the numbers vary so much when you ask historians how many women died during the witch trials. Traditional historians will talk in the hundreds of thousands. Feminist historians of gender and sexuality will generally talk about millions. And women are executed. Now, we're all pretty familiar with the idea of burning a witch. We're familiar with that, but that's really generally not how they're going to do it most of the time. Most of the time, they're just going to hang them. And then they're dead, and they'll be buried in unconsecrated ground. But the circular process, once it's started, is very hard to stop. And we have to ask ourselves at what cost. What is the legacy? Who is this affected? And does it still continue to affect people today? What we've seen is the creation of the other. Women who are not considered pure are considered other. We talk about that in our psychology classes. You've got the Madonna and the whore. We talk about that and how it develops. But does this have an effect on today's women, today's society, and what we look at today? Well, let's look at the psychological impact both then and now. If we look at the psychological impact both then and now, you can see that once you create the other, the woman can be objectified. She can be an object to do what you please with. the psychological impact of the woman who is told or understands that if you deviate from the prescribed gender role, bad things will happen. You will become the other. You will become the whore if you abuse your sexuality. Historically, these women have to watch what happens to their sisters, their cousins, their aunts, their mothers. And as they're watching this, they're going to internalize, I better not step out of my gender role. And then there's going to be another psychological impact. The other psychological impact of while your sister, mother, cousin, friend is dying, is being tortured, and you know what's happening to them, thinking to yourself, please don't say my name. Please don't say my name. Please don't say my name. And there's a guilt established with that will be internalized as well into what we as women live today. These women understand that their very bodies damn them. They understand that they're not so far from accusation themselves. And they're horrified. They're horrified with their response of please don't say my name. They're horrified with the idea that they have to do this. And so women will retreat. Now, there's a specific legacy for men as well. Historians of gender and sexuality agree that when sexuality is repressed, there are these slippage points. Recent studies and inquiries into the history of pornography agree that the early modern period is truly when those negative ideas surrounding the body come about. We've had erotic images since images, we've looked at images. But they aren't considered pornography until the early modern period. And when we look at this, and we start seeing these negative ideas surrounding the body and pornography, this modern construct begins. Men at that time are not getting inundated with traditional sexualized images. They're getting inundated with violent sexualized images. And so what it does is it perpetuates this idea that sex and sexuality should be violent, or it should be dominating. Now, this is the same period that the Marquis de Sade is writing. This is the same period where this idea of sadism is really starting to take hold. And the sexualized images that are readily available are violent in nature. And the images stress the otherness of the object. Do we see how the otherness of the object still exists? She is part of the beer bottle. She has the car magazine over her face. There is an idea here that those are all modern ads. Those are all modern ads. This is the legacy that we're seeing. Women's sexuality is still something both to fear and to exploit. Women who reach beyond their gender roles are still mocked. You might have seen the little clip from Stephen Colbert talking about Hillary Clinton. It's floating around Facebook right now. And they're talking about how she's so emotional. Oh, she's so emotional. She rolled her eyes. She did this. She rolled her eyes. She did this. And, but we have males that are crying, politicians. And they talk about how courageous it is. So women who step beyond what is considered to be an appropriate gender role are ostracized, are objectified. They're shamed. Women who embrace their sexuality are shamed. We talk a lot about slut shaming now. And how many of women have walked through the mall with a parent or a friend and seen someone inappropriately dressed and giggled to the other one, slut. How are we not policing our own that way? How are we not? There's a fine line young women have to walk today because they're expected to perform sexually, but not too much. But there is no definition of what is too much. We've talked about that in my classes. That idea of what is too much and what is not. And usually everybody kind of gets a little twitchy during those lectures. But Women who wear clothing that is simply inappropriate for the situation they're in, we ostracize. This isn't just men putting this upon them. It's women policing other women. Just like during the witch trials, when you have these gender roles that are pretty much established by men, but are policed by women. We continue to objectify. Think about it. There's the girls you date and the girls you bring home to your mom. But what else has happened in modern society? Well, we can go from throwing the witch here, but we're still executing witches in our world. Globally, women are still burned in the 21st century for witchcraft. They're still tortured for perceived slights. But those are in those other countries, right? It doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen in the United States. But since the early modern period, violence against women has actually become acceptable within our culture. It's not okay for a man to hit a woman, but it's okay for it to be pretend. We talk about, in colonial America, the rule of thumb, which is you can hit your wife with anything smaller than around your thumb. We talk about women's perceived legal personhood coming in the 1900s with the 19th Amendment. For the longest time, rape was only defined as penile-vaginal penetration. We still talk about consent and what it means. We have protective legislation in place that says that if a woman has a single drink, she is then unable to give consent, but a man still can. How about this? One of the most popular video game franchises, you get points for raping the prostitute, murdering the prostitute, and you can get a lap dance at the strip club and then go ahead and kill her when you're done. Hurting your sexual partner becomes an advertising campaign for condoms. Women have become part of the objects that are lusted for. Women have become objects themselves. Women's sexuality and their bodies are used in advertising campaign, everything from forced sexual relations to just being naked in order to sell clothes, or being dead to sell clothes. And those are popular in women's magazines. So as I'm concluding, I want you to think about the life you lead. Think about how this legacy of violence against women can be stopped. Think about what we have to do to change society and our perceptions to make it stop. Thank you. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for your riveting talk. There's much I've learned here. You mentioned 90% were women and 10% were men.
Yes.
And I am curious about those men who have been accused and executed as witches. We know, at least with Salem, at least one of them was a guy. Are they often also accused of going against gendered gender norms? Or
No, they've had sex with a witch. That's how you become a male witch. You have sex with a witch, and oftentimes they'll go through the same pricking process, but they're going to take off their shirt, go, oh, yep, there it is. There's your mark, such a side is guilty. And what really skews our numbers for that 90-10 is that the Scandinavian countries actually are relatively equal in their accusations. So it really skews the numbers. You have areas in Germany where they will kill every woman in the town. The image that you had with the breast pinchers was coming out of Germany, and that was out of Walpurga. And that woman actually, her breasts were removed and stuffed in her mouth before her execution. So, yeah, the men are not tried in a very sexual manner, but the women are.
I am curious though, because you did mention something about sexuality and gay men.
Yes.
Would they be susceptible to accusations of going against gender norms though?
They're susceptible for that, but what they're going to be tried for is something completely different. It doesn't have the malfeasance element to it. It doesn't have that the witchcraft connotation to it. It's they're gay. And here's the thing. You cannot be gay in this society very easily, because if you have a wife, you're not gay. It doesn't matter where you go for recreational sex. If you reproduce, then you're fine within the society, unless you get caught in the actual acts. That's the only time that there's a problem.
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
I think you're going much, much too easy on the genesis of this, and where you want to start dealing with it, start where it started, in the church. This is Christian tradition we're talking about. Mm-hmm. You haven't even brought it up. This is all about good Christianity.
It is. It's
still today the same.
You're right. It is.
Nothing has changed. You didn't even mention it.
No, because the Catholics are just as guilty as the Protestants. The areas where it is the most hotbed is in those areas of religious contention, when they're still working under canon law, not common law. And so you still see those inquisitional elements to it, but I was really limited on time. So certain things had to go. Yes, you're right. It does start there. You look at the Malleus Maleficarum coming out in the 1300s. Absolutely. But where you really see it really starting to become a hotbed is when you have those areas of the shifting religion during the Protestant Reformation. It existed, the idea of witchcraft has existed, and they've killed witches for, you can go all the way back, Beth Pollard over at San Diego State, it actually is an expert in the ancient witches. She's looked at them in ancient Greece and Rome, and looking at the witch battles and looking at all of those things as well. So you've had it for even before Christianity, this concept of evil maleficarum. But once religion becomes a huge contention, which is the Protestant Reformation, and that's where you really see it become a hotbed.
So what's the connection between the whole midwife? It seemed like many of the witches were midwives. And so what was the deal there? They wanted to get rid of them? Was that kind of a...
Well, there's two schools of thought. And then there's my school of thought. The first school of thought is that midwives are targeted because they have these secrets of life and death. And the Catholic Church will target those women because they have done they have these secrets and they're not necessarily willing to share. Midwives have a much better record than the doctors, as the doctors are coming into the profession. Doctors in the 1700s are tying sheets around their neck and just kind of feeling around, trying to make sure women's modesty is kept intact, so they're not even looking. But a midwife, she can throw up your skirts because she's a woman and deliver a child. She can see what she's doing. So a lot of people are saying it's because they have that control. There are others that, like, I looked at it, and in certain areas, yes, it's midwives that they're targeting. And that goes into one of the other elements of my thesis, where I talk about the idea of the witch finders themselves are looking for a specific type of woman, and whether that is a young woman up in the Scottish Highlands, or whether that's a midwife in Wales. It depends on which witch finder is looking and who they're picking up. And that goes into the idea that you have essentially sadistic serial killers finding a legitimate place in society, which is one of the things that I argue, is that's one of the things that's happening here, is that the witch finders themselves are sadistic serial killers. They confessed it because they're being tortured, and what's really interesting when you start looking at the confessions and you start separating them out by time period and by area, which would be where one particular witch finder would be working, whether we're looking at Matthew Hopkins, the witch finder general, the witch finder general for England. He was only working in the Lancashire area and the southern areas. What they'll do, what he's looking for in a confession is very different, and his confessions will be different than the confessions in northern Scotland, going up into the Highlands, where I've looked at the confessions, I've looked at the broadsheets, I've looked at some of the personal letters that are going back and forth, I've looked at public letters, and broadsheets are the equivalent of like a newspaper now. And then also the artwork that goes into it as well, to really look at this. And what we're finding is that it's different based on which area, which leads into my idea that you've got sadistic serial killers working. Because it's very different from northern Scotland to southern England, or to English, to France, to Germany. They're very, very different trials. And when you look at sadistic paraphilias, which I did, when you look at those particular paraphilias or problems, mental problems, if you will, that idea of sadism and sadistic torture really goes hand in hand with a lot of these devices that we're finding, that we have this archaeological evidence of, as well as these volumes of work. One of the more interesting things I found is there were two women that basically cross-dressed as men in Scotland because they didn't want to be accused, so they just chopped their hair, wore men's clothes, battened down the hatches, and acted as men. And they were actually two that they found the prickers that were retractable. So they weren't even like trying to out there help their fellow sisters. They were just as guilty in condemning, and they actually were put to death in Scotland. They were put to death, but they were not tried as witches. They were executed, but not put to death as witches. So, it's strategy. Yeah, definitely a strategy. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, so are you saying that different confessions in different areas would actually have different flavors, different imagery, and so forth?
Yeah.
So that could probably be because the witch finder actually, if the women actually believe, some of the women might believe what they're saying, that the witch finder is inserting images in these women's minds.
Oh, absolutely.
To have them, come
in
up
certain
with
areas, they're talking about the texture and the feel of Satan's penis entering them. In other areas, they're talking about rolling around with Satan in different animal forms. So it just depends on the basic twist and the basic kink of the witchfinder himself, that's what's going to come out in the confessions. And then you have these formulary confessions, but it's all shaped around how women understand themselves and the world around them. So the younger girls you have wedding ceremonies, you have marriages to Satan. The older women are just like, yeah, we're rolling around. They're not doing it quite that flippantly, but they're talking about, yes, we were having this good old time, because the older women really kind of understand sex and sexuality a lot better. A lot of those methods were used, if you read the little cards, and they use them on witches, and then on these people for these reasons. So, like, the vaginal pair would be used for women who are witches, because essentially they've sinned with their vaginas. They've sinned there, so we're going to use that there. But then, gay men will be used, it'll be used, and there. One of probably the most interesting things I found when I was doing all of this research was the term sodomy in the 1600s was actually, because all of these women are being tried for sodomy. And I'm like, sodomy? So I started talking about it with my advisors, and we were talking about it. Finally, they're like, you need an etymological dictionary. So I went and I got the etymological dictionary to trace the term. And actually, at that time, the term sodomy was actually bestiality, what we would call bestiality today. Which is really intriguing, because like James the 1st and 6th of England, he was James the 6th of Scotland, 1st of England, actually wrote a witch-finding manual. And this would also be the King James from the King James Bible. Sexuality is completely accepted in Western Europe. You have all kinds of lower rates there. Violence is not. Violence is this horrible thing in this country that's absolutely the reverse, where violence is commonplace and acceptable, whereas and violent images are common, but sexual images are not. And I just see it as kind of a growing pains thing, and as soon as we get to the point where violent images are no longer acceptable, I think we'll see a lot less of this. But, that requires people giving up Grand Theft Auto.
It's not like Europe is without sex crimes.
No, they do have sex crimes. No, they do. They do. But, and they still have a lot of the same things happening that we have here, but they don't have nearly the same idea about violence and sex. You know, you walk through Europe and, you know, you'll see billboards and you'll see boobs and you'll see all those kinds of things. And you go to, you know, you're not going to see that in this country. But yet they won't show certain movies that we make here, that a lot of the slasher movies and things, because they're just too violent. And they cut a lot of different things, different scenes out of European movies, or movies that are transferred over, because the violence is just distasteful to them. So once it becomes more shocking, I mean, you're never going to be able to change the paraphilia. It's going to always exist in a particular percentage of the population. There's always going to be sadism, but we're not going to be able to eliminate that. However, society's response and the glorification of it, we could eliminate that. Any other questions?
In that case, thank you so much.